Sam Preston grew up in Yardley, Pennsylvania, a suburb of Philadelphia. He graduated from Amherst College with a degree in economics in 1965. At Princeton University, he completed his PhD in economics and discovered demography while working with Ansley Cole. From 1968 to 1972, he taught in the Department of Demography at Berkeley and then moved on to the University of Washington, where he directed the Center for Studies in Demography and Ecology. After a short stint in the United Nations Population Division from 1977 to 1979, where he wrote this article, he returned to Philadelphia and the University of Pennsylvania. He eventually became the first Frederick J. Warren Professor of Demography before retiring in 2010. Preston has served as Department Chair in Sociology and Director of the Population Studies Center, as well as Dean of the School of Arts and Sciences. This article starts from concerns expressed by earlier scholars about possible problems due to urbanization without economic development and updates both the empirical evidence and theoretical perspectives related to these concerns. It is important because Preston highlights the dominant role of overall population growth rates in a society as contributing to urbanization.
Pages of Preston's article show us that the issue of urbanization was very much on the radar of governments around the world as a major public policy issue in the late 20th century. Nearly every one of the governments in 116 developing countries officially stated that the rural-urban distribution of their population was unacceptable in some way, meaning that they felt the need to try to do something about it. Three-fourths of these countries wanted to slow down the rate of migration from the countryside into cities. In searching for the reasons why all these governments were so alarmed about urbanization, Preston conducted a study for the United Nations that looked at the actual facts and figures related to world urbanization in the second half of the 20th century. He based this article on his findings. The article's major headings spell out the results of his research. Preston addresses what he says was a commonly held view in the 1970s, that urbanization was happening much faster in developing countries at that time than it had happened in Europe or North America a century or more earlier. Although many developing countries were in fact part of a wave of rapid urbanization in the third quarter of the 20th century, Preston points out that studies by Williamson and others showed almost identical rates of urbanization in now developed countries like England and the United States during the last quarter of the 19th century. He also points out that migration from rural to urban areas actually accounted for more of the earlier 19th century urban growth than it did in the 20th century, since historical rates of natural increase in cities then were lower than they are today. In fact, he suggests that any urbanization wave, dramatic as it may seem, must always be a temporary thing, because once cities reach a certain share of any country's total population, the rate of urbanization starts to level off. He showed us that this already was happening in Latin America in the 1970s, since rapid urbanization started first in developing countries on that continent. So Preston's first aim in this article is to make it clear to us that the rate of movement out of the countryside and into cities that we find in developing countries in the late 20th century is not some kind of strange new emergency, but a pattern that we have seen before. And the places where we saw it before, nearly 100 years earlier, actually seemed to end up just fine as modern, urbanized, industrialized societies with higher standards of living, healthier and more educated populations, in general much better off, partly because they had become urban societies. His message to the United Nations and to his readers is, first of all, don't panic. Then, still in relation to his first point about rates of population movement from rural into urban areas, he goes into more detail about the differences that did exist between different developing countries in the mid-20th century. This also is an important point because it breaks down the mistaken idea that all developing countries were part of a unanimous wave of urbanization. As he puts it on his page 197, quote, "In general, rural outmigration is fastest in countries whose economic performance allows the best possibilities for accommodating the exodus," unquote. He backs up this statement with some facts and figures, distinguishing between two different groups of developing countries. One group with faster economic growth between 1950 and 1975 included Latin American countries like Puerto Rico, Argentina, Chile, and Venezuela, and they saw an average of 25 or more of every 1,000 rural residents moving into cities every year during this quarter century. While in slower growing economies like Ghana, Bangladesh, or Indonesia, as well as a couple of other Latin American states like Paraguay or Guatemala, the rural exodus was less than 1/3 as large, 8 or less per year of every 1,000 rural residents. While he admits that his measures are not very sophisticated on this point, still Preston makes a good case that rural to urban migration can't be explained simply as a push off the land caused by poverty and misery. If that were the case, we might expect more people to move to cities in the slow-growing economies instead. This first of Preston's conclusions seems to send a message to the worried governments of over 100 developing countries that maybe they should calm down because the migration they are seeing from the countryside into their cities is not really something that they need to be that worried about. But if we think carefully about the important point that urbanization is more than just movement of people from rural to urban areas, and that urbanization is not at all the same thing as urban population growth, like Preston, we will have to admit that the situation of these countries was not so simple as this, and that other aspects of that situation also must be considered. It should not surprise us, then, to see that for his second main point, Preston shifts from looking at rural to urban population movements and looks instead at the total growth rates of urban populations. When he makes this shift in his focus, we suddenly see some striking differences between the so-called classical examples of urbanization from the 19th century and the situation in these 20th century cases that he was studying. Specifically, when Preston looks only at the expansion of city populations in developing countries, he reports that these cities in the late 20th century were growing nearly twice as fast on average as cities in the classical urbanization wave 100 years earlier. In that earlier wave, cities on average doubled their populations between 1875 and 1900. But between 1950 and 1975, the population of cities in developing countries nearly tripled instead, up 188% in just 25 years. If one thinks of urban population growth as mostly a matter of people moving in from the rural areas, this tripling seems inconsistent with his no news is good news conclusion about rates of rural to urban migration. But of course that is exactly his second point. As he sums it up in his section heading, quote, "Urban growth through most of the developing world results primarily from the natural increase of populations," unquote. This makes perfect sense when we stop and consider that between 1875 and 1975, the human race made huge progress in controlling parasitic and infectious diseases, increasing the food supply, and generally bringing down the death rates at all ages. When these lower death rates are compared with any given level of the birth rate, the wider difference means faster natural increase. This was, after all, a key point even in Dyson's study of the classical urbanization wave, as he and other scholars like Williamson showed how urban natural increase gradually took over as the major source of urban population growth even back in that earlier age. He adds a small but very important detail to his article that puts the role of natural increase in an even clearer focus. He reports, just before his second main heading on his page 198, that not only did urban populations triple instead of only doubling for developing countries between 1950 and 1975, but the rural populations in these countries also grew on average by almost 50% instead of the increase of less than 20% in the countries observed in the 1800s. The excess growth of the rural populations in the 20th century was proportionately even greater than the excess growth of the urban populations. This simple fact should jump out at us as the smoking gun that reveals the real source of new, faster urban population growth. Indeed, Preston spells this out for us as his third major point, expressed in his third heading on page 199. Quote, "Among the factors that influence the growth rate of individual cities, national rates of population growth stand out as dominant in intercity comparisons." Unquote. With this heading, Preston not only spells out the logical implications of the facts he already has reported about rates of urban and rural natural increase, he also shifts his empirical analysis to a new way of looking at the situation, not seen in most of the other studies of urbanization considered so far. Instead of comparing whole countries to each other, he makes each individual city his unit of analysis. This analysis covers over 1,200 specific cities around the world, but not including China, for which he couldn't get the information, each with at least 100,000 people by about 1960. This means that Preston is not only looking at developing countries, but at all cities in all countries, including cities like London or New York that went through their fastest urbanization a century earlier, in the first wave of change. He looks at how much the population of each city increased between about 1960 and about 1970, generally relying on census reports for his data. With this result measured for all his cities, he then adds several additional measures of possible explanations for different rates of urban population growth. Each of these reflects theories and arguments common at the time for explaining why developing countries were urbanizing so fast. The first of these four factors simply measures the size of each city. Significant positive results for this factor would mean that the larger cities tend to grow faster. Preston considers several arguments why this might be the case, mostly having to do with political as well as economic dominance within a country. Especially the biggest city, and also the capital city, even if it is not the biggest, tends to have more than its share of corporate headquarters, government agency offices, and other features created by the presence of national elites. Such a setting would naturally act as a magnet for in-migrants and might also mean better than average conditions for health, survival, and forming families and having babies, stimulating local natural increase. So Preston actually has one measure for the size of cities generally, and then splits out a separate measure that only applies to the largest city in each country and or the capital city, considered separately from the other large cities in that country. The second factor, Preston measures the overall rate of population growth for the country where each city is located. This measure captures natural increase in both rural and urban areas. It only stands to reason that if population is growing twice as fast in one country as in another, in both rural and urban areas, this will mean not only people being added faster to the urban population itself, but also possibly more people leaving the faster-growing rural areas and moving to these same cities. Since we're not talking about urbanization now, but only urban population growth, of course, overall population growth should be an important factor. After all, the urban population growth itself is by definition a part, possibly a major part, of this overall growth. Economic factors mentioned so often by scholars studying the first historical wave of urbanization appear as Preston's third considered factor. He splits this economic explanation into two parts, as is often done, and considers the starting level of economic development as one predictor, separately from the economic growth that happened between 1960 and 1970, considered as another factor. Significant positive effects for these measures based on gross national product would mean that a higher level of development and faster growth during the 1960s encouraged or enabled faster population growth in cities. Negative effects would mean that poor economic situations or trends were driving people into cities in desperation. When he crunched all his numbers and came up with preliminary results, Preston noticed that even when he accounted for city size and the population and economic growth rates of different countries, cities in some regions of the world still look different from those in other regions. So he added a fourth factor to measure this regional effect, particularly for Latin America in one direction, and parts of Asia and Africa in the opposite direction. He doesn't have much of an explanation for these differences, but he thought it was important to point them out to us, possibly in case someone else could come along later and offer new ways to test better explanations for these residual differences in urban population growth. His results for all four factors in a table on his page 203 and spends considerable time explaining them in the article. For example, he finds that the biggest cities actually grew more slowly than average. This would not have surprised Adna Weber 80 years earlier, since these cities have already had their major growth spurt at some point in the past. Similarly, the more urbanized a country was by 1960, the slower any city in that country was likely to be growing over the next 10 years. These results confirm the idea that urbanization, as well as urban population growth, tend to be part of a temporary transformation that affects different parts of the world at different times in their history. The biggest city and the capital city in each country, on the other hand, do tend to grow faster than average, just as expected by those scholars who point to the national elites who live there and their tendency to soak up all the advantages available in the country. However, there was so much variability in these particular measures that neither of these positive coefficients in his model could be trusted as statistically significant. Notice that they are missing the little A superscripts that mark significance. The economic measures also confirm Preston's interpretation of their role in urban population growth. Cities in more developed countries saw faster urban population growth. If the country was growing faster than average during the measured decade, no matter what its starting level, this also tended to go along with faster growth for cities in that country. The regional factors that Preston has trouble explaining have the signs he described in the article, with slower than expected growth for cities in Asia and Africa, but faster growth for cities in Latin America, though only the positive number for Latin America is statistically significant. One possible factor that we might add to explain this effect could be the population density of the countries involved, since Latin America has lower than average population density and Asia has higher than average population density. But the champion of all Preston's results is the coefficient in this table for the growth rate of each country's population. This coefficient of about 1.0 means simply that for every percentage point of faster population growth in a country, the cities in that country also tended to be growing 1 percentage point faster than average. This is by far the largest and most significant coefficient in the whole table, and after doing his technical calculations, he announces on his page 204 that, quote, "Of the variance explained in city growth rates by all of the factors introduced, fully 85% is accounted for by national population growth rates alone," unquote. That's why he divides all his other tables in the article into columns for groups of countries with different rates of overall population growth, so that he can conclude that, quote, "Without exception, cities in a particular size class experience faster average growth as their country's population growth rate increases," unquote. After discussing his main statistical findings, Preston goes on to consider a different aspect of the ongoing debate about urbanization and its social and economic context. Ever since Adna Weber described this context over 100 years ago, mainly in terms of the growth of industrial manufacturing jobs, scholars often have measured and discussed this changing context in terms of sectors of the labor force. Scholars usually split a country's labor force into 3 separate sectors. Jobs extract raw materials from nature. This sector also sometimes is called the agricultural sector because that is where most people in it are found. But when sorting out all the workers in an economy, we also find fishermen and lumberjacks and others who obtain materials from the environment in this group. Secondary sector jobs transport and transform these raw materials and produce all kinds of finished goods out of them, from soup to skyscrapers. This secondary sector includes all the industrial manufacturing jobs that Adna Weber and so many other scholars during the past centuries have linked to urbanization. But Preston knows that these 2 sectors leave out a third, equally important part of the labor force. All the remaining jobs in an economy that involve neither raw materials nor producing goods make up the tertiary or service sector. Early scholars of development saw these jobs as just byproducts, spun off from the essential manufacturing jobs. But Preston insists that this old-fashioned opinion needs to be reconsidered. The evident bias against services is a bit odd in view of the fact that the vanguard of most developed countries has for some time been tracing out a definition of development in which services play the dominant role. It is not altogether clear why developing countries should aspire to the 19th century rather than to the 20th century European model." Unquote. In the labor force of the United States during the 20th century. Even in 1900, most jobs remained in agriculture, here colored green. But as the decades passed, agriculture shrank and manufacturing jobs in the secondary sector, here colored blue, multiplied. But this growth of the secondary sector peaked shortly after mid-century, and since that time, the service sector, here colored red, continued to grow, displacing both blue-collar and farm jobs. Today, the American economy is as dominated by service jobs as it was by agriculture 100 years ago. As Preston says, the United States, dominated by service jobs, can hardly be counted as backwards or an economic failure. This figure 1 on page 208 makes the same point for the world generally, showing that for every 1% increase in the industrial labor force between 1950 and 1970, the urban percent of the population increased by 2%, or twice as much, which shows that the service sector was also expanding in these economies. It would have been even better, of course, if all of Preston's data about labor force sectors had been based on only urban populations, because some of the jobs in both manufacturing and service are still found in rural areas and small towns. But his attention to the service sector as an independent factor in the transformation of societies remains very important. In his summary at the end of this article, Preston returns to the issue of official government policies trying to affect migration and residence patterns, implied by the government dissatisfaction with such patterns he mentioned in his opening paragraphs. He does not see much potential for such attempts, since he concludes that programs that increase people's options and education are likely only to increase movements toward the largest cities. And since he believes that attempts to restrict people's freedom of movement and their choices are both inefficient and morally objectionable. However, Preston reminds us that it is probably misguided anyway to respond to fears about urbanization by trying to cut down on migration to cities. After all, as he and others clearly show us, most of the urban growth in the classical wave of urbanization, as well as in developing countries today, comes from high birth rates, low death rates, and resulting rapid natural increase within these cities. So for Preston, the logical way to slow down urbanization, if any government is really concerned about it, would be to slow down overall rates of population growth by finding ways to lower the birth rate. Urbanization itself tends to have this effect, which is one reason that he thinks urbanization is a self-limiting process. But any policy that leads to lower birth rates could slow the growth of urban populations by slowing population growth in general.